All right, I'm back and doing another live video blog today. Today I'll be fielding questions from listeners. We'll be doing a Q&A session. After doing my first two video blogs, I gathered a series of questions from listeners and readers, and so I put them together into another video blog session today. Some of the questions for today's session include questions about Saturn entering Capricorn, some questions about Mercury retrograde, and some questions, some other just related questions to Saturn transits and Mercury transits in particular. And also some requests for clarification around some of the points that I made in yesterday's talk on Saturn and time. So for those of you who are tuning in, I have 3 or 4 days here where I have a little bit more time in my schedule, and so I'm experimenting with the live platform and sort of figuring out how to optimize it. I've got a better camera today, so it's the stream should be a little bit clearer. And some people have asked me if I plan on doing this every day now, and no, it's a lot of work to do a video and then to post it everywhere and download it and everything. It takes a long time. So no, I won't be doing these every day, but I have some time, so I'm trying to get a little bit more experience under my belt doing these, because I do plan on doing them maybe a couple times a week, or maybe at least a few times a month, doing more topical, fielding more topical questions from people and things like that. I'm been starting to build the YouTube page, so that's in the works right now as well. I was going to use Zoom today. I will be using Zoom webinars to connect directly to Facebook Live. I'll be doing that probably in the next couple of weeks. I'll try to get that going. At which point I'll really be able to, have all of my teaching tools at my disposal. Yesterday's talk on Saturn and time, I had all of my notes, and I had an astronomy software program ready to go, and my PowerPoint, and it was so organized. And then Facebook didn't seem like I could share my screen and then turn it back off and back to my video, which is what I need to be able to do. So it looks like I'm going to be able to do that with Zoom. So I will, I'll be working on that. Okay, so today, looking at some questions from readers. The first one was, what does the entrance of Saturn into Capricorn mean for those born with the sun or moon in Capricorn? And this is a really great question. So you could kind of apply this to, also I would say the answer I'm about to give, you could apply this to those who have Saturn or, Capricorn rising, or Capricorn in the first house or something like that, because all of them are, when the lights are being affected, when the sun or moon are being affected by a major planetary transit, or when Saturn's entering the first house, it's pretty significant, and it's much more personally impactful. Let's start with the sun. So the sun was Vedius Valens, who's a famous Hellenistic astrologer, called the sun the noetic light, and the sense organ of perception for the soul. And that's a really important idea about the sun, is this idea that the sun is related to how the soul sees, and also how the soul knows. So the sun is always a part of the area of our chart where we are potentially being called back home to spirit, or being called to develop our spiritual life. So there's always that idea of the noetic light of the sun. But sun is also broadly related to this concept, a sort of ancient concept of spirit, which is a little different than the idea of just spirituality. Spirit is also related to ambition, and any spirits that sort of come into your mind or your body and compel you to act or behave in a certain way, based on, basically an attempt to conform your life to specific images. For example, with the sun in the third house in my own chart, I'm compelled to write, and read, and some of the archetypes of the messenger compel me. They're like conscious images in the soul or psyche that compel my actions and behaviors, and my life conforms in action and behavior to those images. Now, that's what we mean by spirit, that it's not like your personal spirit, but the idea of like the daimon in Greek, Greek philosophy. The daimon is like a kind of like a guardian spirit who fills you with a sense of purpose and specific images toward which your life is, again, sort of moving toward. If you've ever read, there's a great book by a depth psychologist named James Hillman, and he wrote a book called The Soul's Code. And in The Soul's Code, he talks about, the compelling myth, or the compelling, it's very similar to Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. There's a compelling myth in the soul that is a part of the trajectory that your life is on in a kind of narrative sense. So when I'm reading a chart for someone, I'll always say, the sun sign is like telling us about your narrative arc. What is your life story about? Toward what end is your life aimed? So it's like, you can also think of the sun as like a gravitational center of meaning in your life, the organizational center of images and purpose and ambition around which your life is sort of organized. And it's not like, not everybody has like a really strong center. Sometimes the center doesn't hold. Sometimes the center is challenged. Sometimes, the center is filled with images that are, the Greeks very much believed that you could have bad daimons in influencing your life. You could also, your core images. I like use a very basic example. Donald Trump, for example, is clearly working with some spiritual forces that compel him to be successful at all costs. It's very Machiavellian, right? So that's not like, not all sun signs are born, equal, and we're all compelled by different things, and we have a different center of meaning reflected in our birth charts. So when Saturn enters the same sign of your of your sun, especially when it's in Capricorn, because it's coming to its home sign, the center of your sense of meaning in life can go through a pretty profound change. So that's the first thing to think about, is just keep it really, really simple. The sun is a deeply important symbol that we study to understand where the center of meaning in our life is, and what kind of direction we have, what is our sense of direction and purpose. And that can undergo significant changes when Saturn is going to be spending time in your home sun sign of Capricorn for 2.5 years or so. What kinds of changes? Well, Saturn being the ruler of your sun sign, I actually think this is really good. It's when you were born, the sun was in the temple of Saturn. That's not its home temple, right? The sun likes to hang out in Leo. That's its home temple. But when it's in the temple of Saturn, its host is Saturn. So when Saturn comes into its home sign of Capricorn, it's like the host of the house is there and can attend to the sun's needs. The sun in Capricorn is, of course, there's a lot of things we say that are really true, like practical, work-oriented, opportunistic, ambitious, hardworking, devoted to work and discipline, serious, sober, sometimes cynical, melancholic. There's a lot of things we can say about Saturn or about Capricorn, Capricorn sun sign, that are certainly true. But when Saturn comes home, it's often as though all of the most sort of difficult qualities about Capricorn, especially those, Capricorn/Saturn is always dealing with the feeling of being an outsider, because you have, and I said this in a talk that I gave a few days ago, Saturn is the farthest planet out, right? And it naturally opposes the signs of the light. So it naturally opposes Cancer, and it naturally opposes Leo. And when it naturally opposes those signs, it means that it's naturally in opposition to the lights. So we say that the sun is in its exile in Saturn's sign of Aquarius, and the moon is in its exile in Saturn's sign of Capricorn, because the lights are in places of a planet that is the dimmest, darkest planet that's farthest out in the solar system, a planet whose symbolic, whose significations include darkness, mortality, suffering, limitation, time, weightiness, etc. So we have a sun sign. You know, when you're born with the sun in Capricorn, your sun is in a sign that has this kind of natural antithesis to light. Of course, there are beautiful things to be found in the darkness as well. Saturn traditionally is related to contemplatives and mystics and hermits, and people who deliberately separate themselves from the sort of superficialities of the world, which is also light. That's also the sunny day world that we live in is also not. It's not just light is not just a symbol for enlightenment and bliss and joy and happiness and peace and all the good stuff. Light is also what you see, but not necessarily what's on the inside. So I with a moon in Capricorn, I happen to love, when it's snowing. It's snowing today. I happen to love when it's snowing, and I happen to love when it's raining. And I, that kind of melancholic mood, I can go inward, because the sort of workaday world, everyone's kind of going inward, and that's the darkness as well. So Saturn is not just darkness in some heavy, bad, moralistic sense. It's also darkness as in soulfulness, or as in that which is invisible or beyond superficial appearances. So you have this kind of duality working with the sun in Capricorn. And the main thing that I think is really positive about Saturn returning to Capricorn is that you have the ruling planet of a sign that is often associated with darkness, for better or worse, coming home to its own sign. So you have one of the great things you have is, if you're a Capricorn, you may be someone who is more in touch with darkness, with things, with the authenticity that exists behind the superficial appearances of the world, the truth behind things. And being in touch with that is not always easy. It's easy to feel like an outcast. It's, a lot of times, it's like, I think it was William Lilly said something about, maybe it was Ficino, talking about those children of Saturn who are like black clad, they're decked out in fashionably like dark attire or whatever. And I think in some ways it's when Saturn comes to your home sign as a Capricorn sun, it's as though it may not be as unpopular or outside the norm to be in touch with darkness. There can be a lot of fruitfulness in the darkness, and so Saturn coming back to its home sign, I think, just allows you some relief in that regard. So I think it's a good thing. I think Saturn coming to its home sign for Capricorn suns, it's a time where your whole sense of meaning and purpose can be changing. And if you're someone who has a kind of deeper, darker, melancholic temperament, or if you're naturally interested in earthy and darker subjects, if you're kind of more soulful, poetic, you have a bit of that kind of a temperament, then I think this is actually a really supportive time. It's a time where it may not be as hard to bear that cross. And in some ways, the validation that you feel during this time can be supportive of going further in the direction that you really feel that you're meant to go. Because ultimately, there's what we all need in some ways in life is when we are on a path that is contrary to the status quo, right? Is we need validation on some level in the inner and outer world that we're on the right path, despite whatever the status quo is. Oh, how do you get that? Well, when one way to get it is when Saturn comes home to Capricorn. It's a period of time where Capricorn suns are not going to be on the same sunny day status quo path as everybody else. And there can be a real deep feeling of validation, as well as external events in your life sort of conforming to support you in your path. So that's one way of looking at Saturn in Capricorn, just feeling like validated that, you know, you're doing what you're doing and it's okay. It's okay if your path is, you know, that a more Saturnine, more heavy, more dark. There's substance in there. There's, you know, there's richness in the deep dark. So that's important. It can also be, on the other hand, it can be a period, the darkness is also just the darkness. So it can be a period where there's a new beginning in your life born of a period of depression, of heaviness, of pain, of sorrow, of suffering. Like that's all there too, right? And usually it's a bit of both, because Capricorns aren't, a Capricorn doesn't get its deep, soulful sense of purpose in life without pain, you know, I mean, how do you get tuned into the darkness? How do you become aware of the value of darkness? It's through pain and suffering. It's through impermanence. It's through darkness. It's through mortality. It's through having to work really hard or having to set aside emotions. You know, that kind of bleakness is part of how Capricorn comes to see the value and the divinity in the darkness. So you know, pain is integral to Capricorn, but this is a transit that can normalize, support, and strengthen your experiences as a Capricorn and provide you with support, stability, and a sense of being, you know, almost like, you know, sort of backed up by the universe, I would say. But then on the other hand, it can be a period, just like I said, where the opposite is true, and it's a period of reconceptualizing your sense of purpose and direction in life because you're going through something painful. And that can be in the external world or the internal world, or both. Circumstances can become painful, difficult, limited, restricted, heavy, hard. Death is sort of, there's endings. But it can also be that, you know, inwardly, everything's fine in the sunny day world of your life, but inwardly, you're starting to feel, there's going to be periods of time as a Capricorn sun where inside you feel that something's wrong, or inside you feel like it's winter, even though your external world looks like it's summer. And those are normal periods. And the same basic things can be said of a Capricorn moon. The one distinction I would give is that whereas the sun tends to be about your center of meaning and purpose in life, and there can be this whole kind of, you know, like a sea change happening with Saturn entering your sun sign, there's also, with the moon sign, there's more of an emphasis on body, your vehicle, your container, your family, your ancestry, you know, the people that surround you in life. The moon is representative of the circumstances that we're born into. It reflects, the moon as a reflective light is talking about things that contain and reflect the divine or the eternal. So the body does that. Our family does that, our genetics, our heredity, our ancestry, our homes, our roots, history. So when the moon is entering when the Saturn is entering Capricorn, and you've got a moon in Capricorn, like I do, like I'm anticipating things with my family. Like I'm not to be a Debbie Downer, but I'm pretty sure my grandma will pass at some point during these 2.5 years. She's pretty old. She's in her 90s. So Saturn over the moon, like I would anticipate generational or family contractions where there's death and generational change, karmic and ancestral work that's being done, healing in the body, potentially health crises in the body, healing crises in the body. One thing that Saturn, you know, does is it builds us into more of who we are through taking things away. So a lot of pain in life comes from from expending energy and time and resources in areas and places in our life that don't actually, you know, they're not actually good for us. And this is you know, especially with Saturn and the moon, you're talking about resources and environmental factors. Or same thing with the sun, though, your center of meaning. Saturn coming through your home sign, especially if it's a conjunction, it's the start of a new cycle. When Saturn comes to join in the same sign as a planet, it's starting a new cycle with that planet. So you can think of like a whole new chapter in your life basically getting started. And you know, that can involve you know, some sort of contractive healing crisis, but the beginning of something new kind of coming out of that. So Yeah, if anyone has any other questions about that, feel free to post. So that was the first question. And I think, let's see. Yeah, that's pretty much it for that one. Let's see. So next question was, is it any more intense when Saturn is transiting the last degrees of a sign as it is now in Sagittarius? Yes, that's a great question. So if we look at Ptolemy's table of planetary rulerships, or maybe this is the Dorothean, I'm not sure which one I have in front of me. I think this is the Egyptian. If you look at the last degrees of Sagittarius, the bound ruler of the last 4 degrees of Sagittarius in the Dorothean table is Mars, and most of the excuse me, so if you let's back up a second. So if everybody knows what the bounds are, every sign of the zodiac is comprised of 30 degrees, right? And all of those 30 degrees are broken into chunks of degrees, 5 of them for each sign. The sun and the moon do not rule any of these chunks, but the rest of the planets all rule the different chunks as they're broken up. So, for example, you may have, you may have a planet in the last few degrees of Sagittarius, and according to the bound rule, there's a couple different bound rulership tables, but the last few degrees of Sagittarius are said to be ruled by Mars. So these little like departments or wings of the signs are governed by planets. They're called bound rulers. So when you have Saturn leaving the last degrees of Sagittarius, it's in the bound of Mars. So yes, it's difficult. But the greater question is it difficult for all planets when they're sort of leaving the final degrees of a sign, especially the malefics like Mars or Saturn, who are, kind of difficult when they're a little bit trickier to navigate, and the answer is that within these bound rulerships, the last degrees of the signs are all pretty much ruled by malefics. So you have the last 5 or 6 degrees of every single sign. The bound ruler of those degrees is either Saturn or Mars. So yeah, it does seem like in the zodiac, they're built into the zodiac is the idea that the culminating degrees of every sign involve Saturn and Mars. So there's a kind of contractive and destructive or disintegrating effect at the end of signs when planets are transiting through them. And that makes a lot of sense if you just think of, the transit of a planet moving through a temple, and when it goes into the temple, it goes through Venus and Jupiter and Mercury and so forth, and then when it gets to the very end, it hits Mars and Saturn. I think it's a way of, there's almost like a Taoist like move, it's like a Tao-like movement to the way that planets move through signs. So at the end, there is more of a falling apart or a culmination of something, but it's also a kind of intensification and confrontation energy at the end of a sign. So yeah, right now, if you look, the easiest way to figure this out in your own birth chart is look at your chart and to see where Saturn is transiting. And, in this case, like Sagittarius, I use whole sign houses, which makes this kind of thing really, really easy. Look at Sagittarius and say, where is Sagittarius in your chart? The last degrees of that sign, it's culminating in that sign, which means it's in some ways bringing the topics of that whole sign house to conclusion. And when it enters a new sign, it's entering a new house in whole sign houses, which is what ancient astrologers used. So one of the predominant systems that they used. So when you're, it is more intense, and you'll, if, for example, Mars was just culminating at the very end of Libra, and we had this, sort of announcement about, Jerusalem, and the Trump calling the Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Now that's a whole can of worms. But this actually leads really nicely into the next question. Someone said, could you discuss Mercury's retrograde with Saturn and Sagittarius and why it matters? Well, that, we could spend a lot of time on that, but I'll just say this. So first of all, when Mercury is retrograding over Saturn, anytime Mercury is retrograding, in a conjunction with Saturn, you're talking about the possible revision of technical or organizational structures. So we have the tax code being overhauled, for example. We have the net neutrality thing going on. So there's a bunch of like total structural overhauls being proposed, right? And there is really important, there can be a Saturnine kind of quality to them, which means limiting, controlling, authoritarian, strict, dark, rigid, conservative, etc. So there's a kind of, dark Saturnine empowerment to the kind of structural changes that are being proposed or explored right now. The other thing to note is that really important for this Mercury retrograde is the fact that Mercury is in Jupiter's sign and Saturn is in Jupiter's sign. And so we have, for a while now, right, we've had a really bombastic Saturn. We've had Saturn who is, conservative and stern and, kind of tends toward that kind of fundamentalist hardness. And we have Saturn in Jupiter's sign, who is, much more of the preacher and the exaggerator and the big showman. This is like, very fitting for the kind of uprise and sort of Tea Party and Sean Hannity and all of this kind of stuff, Trump and all of this has been very Saturn and Sagittarius in that regard, where you have the old, make America great again. It's old and it's bombastic. It's Saturn and it's Jupiter. So you have always study a planet when it's not in its home sign. You always have to study it in relationship to the planet sign that it's in. What's really kind of scary about what's happening right now is that, and exciting, is that we have, for a while, we had Saturn in Sagittarius while Jupiter, its host, was in Libra. So there was all sorts of stuff going on with the Supreme Court, the travel ban, justice, fairness, equality, lot of that, going on. So, but now, now Jupiter has entered Scorpio, and that there's nothing wrong with Jupiter in Scorpio, but it's a problem for Saturn because Scorpio is the 12th sign relative to Sagittarius. So whenever you're looking at in Hellenistic astrology, whenever you're looking at analyzing a planet as an omen of something, you have to study its ruler if it's not in its home sign, because that's basic to telling you about the condition of the sign that you're studying. So you're studying Saturn and Sagittarius, you're studying Mercury retrograde coming over Saturn and Sagittarius, then you have to look at Jupiter. Where is Jupiter? Well, Jupiter just ingressed into the 12th sign relative to Sagittarius. So Sagittarius becomes the first, and then you count off from Sagittarius is 1, Capricorn is 2, Aquarius is 3. You go all the way around, and Scorpio, the sign right behind Sagittarius, becomes the 12th sign relative to Sagittarius. And the thing that makes that possibly not so good is that you have what is the symbolism of the 12th house traditionally? It's called Malas Daemon, which means bad spirit. The 12th house is the quintessential dark night of the soul house, right? It's a house that's related with bad spirits who throw you off course. It's related to self-destruction. It's also related to disease and hospitals and prisons. But it's also related to loss that can bring you closer to the divine. Ego loss, material loss, things that we lose in life that have the potential to bring us closer, or solitude, and the kind of dark loneliness of the soul that can also be about bringing you closer to, the divine. For this reason, the 12th house was traditionally called the joy of Saturn. So when Saturn's dispositor, Jupiter, is in the 12th sign relative to Saturn, it also means that when Saturn is finishing up in these critical last degrees of Sagittarius, and then Mercury comes over the retrograde to Saturn, with Jupiter in the 12th sign relative to Saturn, you have, for example, you have an announcement like the Israel announcement, declaring this very bombastic, and malefic and self, even for Trump, sort of a self-destructive thing to do as a politician. It wasn't even a smart, it's like he's antagonizing people all the time that are against really his own self-interest even. And, so at any rate, but that's a part of the fact that, Mercury's coming retrograde back over Saturn. And you're making a kind of bold Saturnine announcement, and it's in the spirit of Jupiter. It's a sort of religious proclamation. It's bombastic. And Jupiter's in the 12th sign of Scorpio relative to Sagittarius, which adds this aura of self-destructiveness to it, of real kind of like a dark spirit. That's what that is. So now that doesn't mean that you just sit around and think, oh, Jupiter in Scorpio is just about bad spirits. That's not it at all. You're only reading Jupiter in the 12th sign relative to Saturn and Sagittarius in the specific context of trying to understand the relationship of Saturn and Mercury to the announcement that's made. As that's one thing that we struggle with all the time as students of astrology, is that people forget that the signs and planets become representative of discrete things. They're not just energetic trends that are happening for everybody everywhere at all times. When you see an announcement on the news that Trump has declared, Jerusalem the capital of Israel, what you're looking for is what planets in the sky most adequately reflect that announcement. That you had to make it really discrete to study the omen carefully and to understand its meaning. In this case, it happens right as Mercury retrograde's coming over Saturn. Like, that's it. That's the announcement, right? Especially since Saturn, as we talked about in yesterday's talk on Saturn and time, Saturn is a planet that is connected to the Golden Age. So this idea of Saturn gets caught in the literalness of time. That's what we talked about yesterday. So you think of like, oh, I'm progressing through time. I'm moving towards some ideal thing that's going to make me really happy. Capricorn works really hard to climb up some kind of mountain in time and space to get somewhere and achieve something. But it's starting from the darkest place. And remember, a lot of ancient astrologers believed time was cyclical. So when you think of, for example, that's why Saturn in Greek myth rules the Golden Age, but he's also usurped by his son Zeus and thrown down and becomes the quintessential planet of an outcast or a grumpy old man who's no longer in power, right? So you have both. You have Saturn as the Golden Age and Saturn as the grumpy old man who gets replaced by by Zeus, the sun. When you're thinking about Capricorn, you're thinking about a sign that embodies that duality. Ebenezer Scrooge, or Christ carrying a cross up to Calvary. You've got people who are ambitious and greedy and opportunistic, and they're trying to reach a place in the material world that ultimately isn't cannot give them happiness, because everything in the material world is impermanent. But on the other hand, you have the sort of value of hard spiritual work, of trying to make the world a better place. And we talked about this yesterday, of not being attached to the results and things like that. So this is a little bit of a segue, but this is why Saturn is a really good in Sagittarius, very appropriate for the Make America Great Again slogan, right? Because Make America Great Again reflects this idea of Saturn as the ruler of the Golden Age, right? So it's like, let's go back to the time when we were great. This is the grumpy old man, right, who's gotten kicked out of the kingdom, who he wants back. He wants, the road back to his Golden Age. That's Saturn. That's how Saturn thinks. But interestingly enough, in order to get back there, we've got to climb up this long, hard mountain. And in his inauguration speech, Trump's inauguration speech, it was it was so dark and so bleak, and yet his base heard it as this incredibly optimistic thing. A lot of his base heard it as, the call to climb up the mountain, to return to some status that's been lost. So when Mercury retrograde goes back over that Saturn, and you have the same bombastic, a leader calling us to go back to make America great again, saying, "Oh, and Jerusalem is the real capital of Israel." So no, it's the same thing. It's the old city of God. It's the real one. He's trying to get us back to some kind of golden age, and it's really bombastic and Jupiterian, but it's also really stuck in the past, which is something that Saturn can do. As I mentioned, in yesterday's talk, the other thing that's really profound about Saturn is that Saturn was associated with mystics, contemplatives, astrologers, people who studied the nature of time, and by understanding it's that time is cyclical, they end up being able to see through time. So astrologers are students of time, but students of time who recognize that time is, as Plato said, a moving image of eternity. So it's a really complex sign. Capricorn is very complex because it's a sign of mystics and contemplatives, people who understand the transparency and non-duality of time. Time itself is an eternal archetype, but you also have people who can easily get stuck in the march of progress through time, or trying to return to some golden past, or all of the literalness of time can be really, really pronounced as well. So that's a very long-winded way of saying when Mercury retrogrades back through is going backward over Saturn in the last degrees of Sagittarius, which are of the nature of Mars. They're difficult. And then you see Jupiter in the 12th sign relative to Sagittarius. That's where you get that kind of these dark announcements and these dark revisions of structures, and all of them are based on the idea of trying to return us to something from the past. And they're seeing that as simultaneously a progressive march up a mountain, a hard soldiering onward to accomplish something. All of that super, Saturn in Sag culminating in those last degrees. So anyway, that's kind of a full analysis of how you look at it. But in terms of our personal lives, most of us aren't caught up in the politics. So how do you understand it? I think, one way of looking at it is the addressing of old beliefs. Like, are we looking at beliefs that we have right now that are outdated? Are we doubling down and becoming more conservative or intense about something? Are we restructuring or reconsidering the way that we use technology or media? Like, these live casts are a product of Mercury retrograde over Saturn. I'm restructuring the way that I do some of my, presentation of teaching and horoscopes and stuff like that. So there's a call to revision, to look at the past, to think about redoing structures, to think about how you communicate. I've seen a lot of people talking about how they're becoming more mindful communicators. They're trying to become, better at communicating, or they're trying to become better writers or more concise writers, things like that. So, it's a revisionary time for mental structures and text structures and organizational structures and things like that as well. So I hope that helps. But someone asking about the nature of, this, could you speak to why this is so powerful that Mercury is retrograde with Saturn in Sagittarius? Why is it so powerful right now? And I think hopefully that explanation helps. Can you begin a new job or project under Mercury retrograde? Yeah, of course you can. People do it all the time. So, one of the main things to understand about the kind of whole culture around retrogrades is that retrogrades are normal. They're natural. They happen all the time. In fact, the very nature of the planets as a theoretical component in astrology, their nature is to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's what they do. So I don't know, how it became so popular to say, if a planet is stationing or retrograde or whatever, don't do this or do that or whatever. To me, a lot of this comes from a culture that's really interested in trying to use astrology as a form of sort of like, magical technology to get what you want. And I think that's really a problem. I'm not a big, this is just my own personal philosophy speaking. I'm not a big fan of like looking at the astrology in fear or anxiety or, desperation or like how can I use the astrology or the astrological like transits to like, you know, bootstrap my desires in the world. I think, you know, it's really important to understand that from the traditional astrological philosophy perspective, anything that you get lost in the material world it's going to end someday. The first noble truth of all of these mystical traditions is impermanence, right? And the suffering that accompanies not living with a recognition of impermanence. So if we live in fear of the planets all the time, or if we try to use the planets to fulfill our desires all the time, it's all we're doing is entangling ourselves more deeply in the material illusion. That's my own philosophy speaking. That doesn't mean that we can't use astrology intelligently, but the first layer of that question is just addressing any superstition or, you know, any way in which fear or desire can kind of interrupt us. I think that you can always start a new. It depends, right? Like if you're starting the project, like for me right now, like I'm starting the project of kind of redoing some of my offerings, and I just launched this video blog. Is there anything, you know, like wrong with that? No, it's a learning process. I'm going to keep figuring it out. So if you're revising some kind of technological structure in your life, if you're working on changing how you communicate, present yourself, if there's a contract being renegotiated, if there's plans that are being made, the thing to notice is that when the planet turns retrograde, does it naturally bring to your mind things that need changing? Or does it bring to your mind something that's really, really impulsive that you need to do like right away? It's always easy to know if you're getting taken for a ride by Mercury retrograde by pausing and thinking about what you're going to do before you do it. So like, you know, the simplest instruction I could give to somebody is like, oh, you want to begin a new job or project under Mercury retrograde. Did you just think of it this morning? You know what I mean? Like, if so, you should probably sit with it a little bit, you know, but that's good advice for anybody. And also remember that Mercury is retrograde, you know, 3, sometimes 4 times a year. It's like, I don't even know what it is, like a quarter of the year that Mercury is in its shadow retrograde or second shadow period. So, you know, in understanding Mercury's archetypal nature, you have to understand that its nature is retrogradation. That's what it's doing most frequently. That's its most observable behavior, is to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So if you're getting caught up in some kind of impulsive desire to immediately change your circumstances and you haven't really thought it through, well, you should always be careful of that. And Mercury retrograde isn't so much, you know, like a bad time to start something under, as much as it is a signal that changes may be happening and that you have to be somewhat patient or mindful or thoughtful about how you implement them. That's it. That's the kind of things that happen under retrogrades. So I wouldn't stress out about them. Now, if like one thing that I am sort of like careful about, right, is that when Mercury is like stationed, it's not moving like at all. You have a symbol of something not moving. And so like if you purchase a plane ticket under a Mercury retrograde and you end up getting stuck on the tarmac for 3 hours inside of the airplane and you can't take off, your flight is delayed, you have to sit in the airport for 6 more hours until the weather passes. It's not that Mercury caused that as much as it is that when you're buying the ticket, there's a pretty good symbol in the sky, a planet related to transit and travel not moving. There's a pretty good omen that, like, you know, you might get stuck, you know? So like you don't have to, you know, freak out about Mercury retrogrades causing anything. No more than if you flipped the tarot card, would you say, you know, I flipped the sun card in tarot. It caused me to, you know, like get pregnant or have a baby. It's, you know, like Mercury retrograde is not causing anything to happen in your life. So but you have to study the symbol in the context of what's arising in your life. And that's how we can slowly start to, you know, maybe burn off some karma or make a better decision or, you know, be aware of a lesson that's being, a lot of the times, you know, Mercury retrogrades are giving us opportunities to see something that we wouldn't normally see, especially during the station periods, both retrograde and direct, because Mercury's stopping. It gives us the potential to stop. And if we don't, and we do a bunch of stuff under the stopping periods, then later it may be that you get stuck and you're forced to think about something that you didn't think about when you rushed off to do it when this thing wasn't moving. That's a good way of thinking about Mercury retrogrades as well. Could you clarify Saturn's relationship to time? I think I already did that. Could you clarify the astronomy you mentioned in the talk you did on Saturn as the ruler of time? I think that would take too long, and we're already a ways in, so I'm going to skip that one as well. What does it mean that Saturn is changing houses in my chart? That's a really good question. So when Saturn changes signs, as I mentioned earlier, it's changing whole sign houses if you use Hellenistic astrological house system. The main thing to take note of there is that that brings up brand new topics in your life. So for example, Saturn's going to be entering my 9th whole sign house in a couple of weeks. And within 1 month of it entering my 9th whole sign house, the place of foreign countries, spirituality, astrology, mysticism, this is the quintessential traditional house of astrology and all spiritual matters and pilgrimages to holy or foreign places. Within a month of Saturn entering my 9th house, I'll be going to India. Like really, really basic. Like when Saturn enters a new house in your chart, when any planet enters a new house in your chart, especially when it's long and ponderous and slow moving like Saturn, then a whole new set of topical themes are going to be pronounced in your chart. This is, a lot of times modern astrologers end up creating like huge, crazy orbs for the planets, like this planet affecting that planet. It needs like a 15-degree orb and all of this. And I really believe that some of that is misguided because they're noticing effects starting a lot earlier. So they use a really wide orb for a planet, but traditionally the planet affected the whole sign house that it was in for as long as it was in the sign, because a sign is a house. So you have, as long as Saturn is in Capricorn, if Capricorn is your 7th house, relationships are important. And then when Saturn leaves the 7th house, the 8th house topics get activated, and then those topics are important for the whole time that Saturn is in that sign. And that's really how traditional astrologers seem to have understood the ingress of a planet into a new sign. It ingresses into a new house. So it's a new kind of karmic period that's coming up. So yeah, definitely, I really recommend everybody try whole sign houses at some point, especially when looking at the changes of planetary signifiers into new signs. It really gives you a sense of what's going on. How can I cure Saturn transits? Well, this is tough, right? Because on the one hand, Saturn is heavy and painful. And so wouldn't anybody want to like heal or cure themselves of like, difficult Saturnine times? So we'll say something about that. But first, we should say that there is so much aversion to darkness. So much of spirit, like modern spirituality is based on the idea that light is good and dark is bad. And this is a duality that's just as potentially delusional and damaging to the life of the soul as anything else. All of the, sacred Indian texts that I love the most, they all teach the same thing. They all say like people who get lost in sorrow or joy in this world are only perpetuating the cycle of karma and rebirth and pain and so forth. So, life moves in predictable ups and downs. That's the basic idea of ancient astrology. We talked about this yesterday when we held up this my mala beads and said, life is moving through a constant cycle of ups and downs, joy, bliss, life, death. It's going round and round like that endlessly. That's what ancient astrologers believe. We talked about, again, Plato saying that time is a moving image of eternity, and it's cyclical, and in some sense it's mechanical, and it's based in cause and effect, and it has no ultimate beginning and no ending. It just keeps cycling. So for the soul, who is eternal, coming in and out of bodies and forms in the material world, it's very easy to get identified with the pleasures and the pains, the ups and the downs. But when we do that, what tends to happen is we forget that our soul is of the nature of the entire circle at once, and that our soul of the being of the nature of the entire circle at once is also made in the image of God, or is a part of God. And so when, most mystical traditions suggest that we have to cultivate a healthy, not an unhealthy, but a healthy level of detachment from all of the ups and downs of this world. That doesn't mean that you don't cry. It doesn't mean that you don't experience pain. It doesn't mean you don't experience happiness. It means that you don't get lost in them. There's a big difference. It's not saying to bypass your human nature. It's not saying to bypass emotion. It's not, this is not the teaching. The teaching is about remembering that you're the whole thing. You're the whole circle. And that's one of the reasons why we count off the beads over and over again, repeating our mantras, Om, 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 to remember that we are all of it. You had a shitty day, you're still eternal. You had a great day, it'll go away someday and you'll feel crappy again and you'll still be eternal. You have a bad day, it'll go away and the sun will rise again, right? That's how this world is. So how do we fight for the good? How do we, clearly nobody's going to change the fact that you prefer a sunny day to getting punched in the face. Like nobody, you're not going to change that about your nature, right? That's not the point. To like truly, I'm indifferent. You could punch me or I could have a sunny day and I'd be like happy with both. Like nobody's going to change like that. But how do you stay in touch with something bigger through all of it? The first thing in terms of curing a Saturn transit is by not, Saturn works in your favor the best when you don't privilege joy and happiness and bliss and sunny things over dark things. So moving into pain, moving into suffering with acceptance, the dark night of the soul, asking the divine or God to meet you in the midst of that place. That's a Saturn. That's how you cure a Saturn transit, I think, in the very first place. But the other thing that's really important is during Saturn times, if you're feeling depressed or sad or anxious or melancholic or heavy, or there's painful things happening in your life, then you have to find practices that bring the knowledge of your eternal nature into your life every day. You see, one of the best ways to treat, Saturn is like mundane. Saturn hurts. It's boring. It's ordinary. It's the mundane, yucky cruelty of material life. That's part of Saturn. So how do you, the question becomes, how do you address that? Well, something that's really, really mundane is daily discipline. I know it's like everybody hates it, right? But nobody likes it. But if you make spiritual practice, prayer, alone time, a walk in the woods, meditation, whatever it is that connects you to that thing that is bigger than yourself, that transcends the pain and the ordinariness, but you have to embody it every day as a daily discipline. It has to be a structural part of your life, and you have to do it every day, even when you don't want to do it. And you can't think, well, I can't do it because I'm not good at doing it, because otherwise you'll never become good at it. So creating discipline for yourself during difficult Saturn times, and sticking to them, and the discipline being something that keeps you in touch with your eternal nature, your inner life. That's the main way that I would say you cure a Saturn transit. And then the obvious answer is, if it's really, really dark, add a little light. I don't like to use that one first because it's what we all go to rather than really becoming friends with Saturn. And we become friends with Saturn by entering the darkness, accepting it, and cultivating discipline, mundane discipline, to remember the eternal within the grind of life. Oh, it's a really crappy season of life. That's actually a really good time to meditate. Just because you're not feeling sunny doesn't mean it's in fact, most of the times, it's far easier to meditate when it's like sunny and bright and nice. People are like, oh, I feel great, I'm going to meditate. That's not really why you meditate, Anyway, so So that's how you cure Saturn transit. I see a couple questions here, and we'll close with some of these. What about Mars in Capricorn? Well, Saturn coming into Mars in Capricorn is exalted, right? So probably I would imagine at least part of this transit is going to be a time of, real work, really, really like hard work and discipline. Similarly with the Sun, Saturn coming into Capricorn can be about a great work, a great project, creative solidification. Here I would see discipline, rigor, increase of responsibility with Mars and Capricorn. It's a very powerful Mars, so I think and ultimately its host is coming home, so it's a very supportive, and I would say go and accomplish and rock whatever you're doing kind of transit. It could also be about limiting hubris, limiting pride, limiting your Mars in some way, providing it with form. That kind of thing. How would it affect a transit conjunction to the South Node in opposition to North Node? So if your natal South Node is in Capricorn, I think that's what you're asking, Jennifer. Well, the South Node is therefore ruled by Saturn. And traditionally in Indian philosophy, which is the way that I go with the nodes, the South Node is auspicious because although it's related to material loss and suffering, and it's of the nature of Saturn, it is also related to periods of time that draw us closer to the divine, because it's often not, nobody comes to me, right, for an astrology reading really concerned about the good stuff that's happening in their life. Like nobody comes and says, oh man, things are so good right now. So could you tell me how to make sure that I don't get lost over, in this good period? Like nobody says that. Everybody comes and says, hey, things are really, really, bad right now. What do I do to change it? Mostly we don't like pain and we like happy stuff, South Node, however, is a time where there's a potential for consolidation, restriction, loss, decline, conservation of energy, lessening or losing, tightening, and yet it's exactly that gets us closer to what's essential, our divine nature. It's often those South Node transits, especially in the Vedic tradition, that are really auspicious for spiritual life. So that's how I would look at that, as opposed to say a North Node. North Node, it was thought of by Indian astrologers as very hungry, like a hungry, ravenous ghost that propels us to perpetuate reincarnation because it's so hungry and it wants something, it desires something, it craves something. So if you know the myth in the Indian astrology about the nodes, there's the Rahu and Ketu are the severed head and body of a demon, an asura, who's basically tries to steal the nectar of eternal life from the demigods, and he drinks it, and he's drinking it selfishly. He wants to live forever in a selfish, egotistical way. So as he's drinking it, he gets caught, and it was one of Krishna's consorts, God, maybe it's Lakshmi, I can't remember, cuts off his head with the chakra of time and divides his head from his body. And the body is, sort of becomes enlightened because it's killed with a divine weapon, and the head is sort of it has the nectar caught in its throat, the nectar of immortality, but it's still like a hungry demon. So it's sort of like perpetually hungry for more lifetimes, more experiences, more desires. So the North Node, you have to be really, really careful of. The North Node, Rahu, is very malefic in the Indian tradition. It's connected with things that we want or desire, that we think we need, that otherwise we won't be fulfilled. And it's very contrary to how we think about the nodes in the West, especially through evolutionary astrology. I would say with the North Node going to, you need to be really careful about the kind of ambitions that start coming up when, anytime you have like a nodal return, the North Node, or something transiting your North Node, just be careful about what you get hungry for. It'll probably be more, you may get it and it may feel, one of the things that they say is like, the North Node feels good going down, feels bad coming out, you know? So be careful of that with the Saturn and the North Node. So South Node, something's coming out, and it may not feel good, but it's coming out, which is good. So that's how you can think about it. Now you can take the different view of the nodes too. That's fine. It's just my view. Saturn is going into my 8th. Linda, when I had Saturn enter my 8th house, which is just finishing up in, I had 2 grandparents pass away, and my yoga studio, which is my wife, we own the studio together, but my wife manages it, and the yoga studio started becoming a lot more productive financially. But also there's a whole lot of like fear of like death and fear of death and stuff like that. Anyway, I could go into a long thing about that, but I won't. But dealing with fear and coming to terms with mortality and fear, becoming stronger through an encounter with that, I think is a big part of the 8th house. I already mentioned Saturn over the natal moon at the very beginning, B, so I won't cover that. David says, if reading in whole sign calculation, how does one reconcile the topical position changes from Placidus or other house calculation? Feels like trying to convey both meanings to a client can muddle the message, or that it spreads thin the focus. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend doing both, right? I don't, the only thing that I pay attention to is the nearness of a planet to the angles as defined by quadrant-based houses. That's important for me in a reading, like the planets being near the ascendant, descendant, MC or IC. But otherwise, I use whole sign houses. I just think for ingressing planets, if you're studying your own chart, try whole sign houses, because oftentimes you'll see that the change of topics really happens as soon as the planet changes signs. This idea of the dark night of the soul would be especially relevant for those of us with Saturn and Capricorn. Sure. Yeah, totally. As I mentioned this kind of earlier, so you could maybe, if you missed the first part, you could look back at that. But yeah, if you have a Saturn return in Capricorn, that's another. You're born with Saturn in Capricorn, so you're no stranger to ambition, possibly starting from nothing. The challenges of being an ambitious person without getting lost in ambition, how do you work toward spiritual development and growth without turning spirituality into just another form of material ambition? Those are all really difficult, deep questions for Saturn and Capricorn folks who I think are have a genuine need to have a good relationship with the darkness. Mike says, hey Mike, how's it going? Okay, David, the differences in nodes just blew my mind. Is there a reconciliation synthesis between the two schools of thought? I don't think so. I understand that they're quite different, but I actually think there's no evidence whatsoever in the history of astrology that the nodes as they are defined now in the modern tradition, as the North Node is what you need to do to grow from an evolutionary standpoint. Ancient astrologers didn't believe so much in the evolution of the soul. Like, that's not a thing. So the soul is the soul is the soul. Nothing can be added to the soul and nothing can be taken away from the soul. Not from the kind of Indian classical standpoint. In yoga philosophy, the only thing that the soul can do in the material world is be more or less aware or awake to itself within the material form. And the delusion that it's not perpetuates reincarnations. But when you're awakening to the soul, it's not like, the soul itself is not evolving. In other words, your material forms may present the appearance of evolution, but you have to remember that their view of time is cyclical. Nothing that evolves doesn't eventually devolve. So they're not coming at it from this sort of hyper progressivist. You remember a lot of the views of evolution in modern astrology come from a period in time where evolution as a value is starting to really come on the rise. It's evolution, technological progress, the Industrial Revolution, the future as an altar that we worship at is becoming more and more pronounced. And when we project that onto the life of the soul, we're projecting a linear view of time onto the soul. And soul is not linear like that. So I'm very, very skeptical of the philosophical values of evolutionary astrology, even though I think evolutionary astrologers in the modern world, especially like Stephen Forrest, I think he's like an elder and one of my favorite best astrologers out there and does really good work for people. I just happen to not agree with the idea that the soul evolves, or with the idea that the nodes represent something of the evolutionary path of the soul. It's an interesting idea, but I don't see any it's contrary to my own philosophical values. So but that's it, they're philosophical values at the end of the day. So Autumn says, I've tried to decipher my 0 Sag 12th house North Node turning 29 Scorpio through progression. Any thoughts on the significance? Maybe. For me, everybody has different tools that they like as an astrologer. I don't pay a lot of attention to progressions. I use zodiacal releasing and transits for the most part, which are just 2 different tools. But I mean, I guess what you could say is if you're using whole sign houses, it's changing houses. So the focus of the North Node in your life, of where you feel really hungry and ambitious for something, and the temptation to perpetuate, sort of perpetuating karma, which we're all going to do, by the way. It's not like, the North Node isn't like a suggestion, it's like something that's happening. I have the North Node, for example, in Leo in my 4th house, right? Jupiter is transiting over Leo in my 4th house, and suddenly I think it's a great idea to have a kid and buy a house, right? This has complicated my life 10 times more than I ever thought it was. It has created 10 times more pain than I ever thought it would. I love my wife, I love my daughter, and I love my house. But it's also 10 times more energy to maintain those things than my like, starry-eyed, ambitious, hungry Jupiter over my North Node in the 4th house intentions could have ever understood. And I'm not suggesting that it's bad to have kids or a family or anything like that. But from a karmic standpoint, these traditions do tell you in time, over many lifetimes, you will burn off the desire to continue to perpetuate further lifetimes through these kinds of desires. You'll realize over time that you're already right at home in the soul. And that also doesn't mean that that there's anything, again, there's nothing wrong with having kids in a family. Like from the North Node standpoint, the opportunity of the North Node is about learning that your eternal soul is all you need. It's all you truly need through the experience of consuming and taking things in that you didn't really need. So even though that sounds like a horrible thing to say about family and children, no, the rest of my life, my duty to them is my dharma, and it becomes the exact source of drawing me closer to God. You have to have a sense of humor about it, right? It's not like punitive. You know what I'm saying? Like, and so, every day when, when I'm taken away from all of my ambitions, all of the stuff that I want to do, because my ambitions led me into a place of needing to serve my home and family a whole lot compared to what I used to, that's drawing me closer to the divine. That duty of being bound to what I desired and chose, and the amount of maintenance it requires and what it takes from me, draws me closer to the divine as well. So you really have to love what you choose. That's really, really important. But it does, like in time, like I have a pretty good feeling that in future lifetimes, like I probably won't choose the path of householder again. Like I can feel that in me. That's just, that's my truth. So at any rate, but that does not offend my wife. I don't think it offends if a lot of parents out there were honest, like really, really honest. Like my parents are being honest to me now that they're like, in their 60s and so forth. And we're all like, like it's not going to hurt my feelings. They're like, yeah, it really complicates and devastates your life and your ability to cultivate your spiritual life when you stack your life up with all of these intensely complicated things. That's just the truth. So, but that also, by the way, is a North Node kind of truth and a very Saturnine kind of truth. Like it's hard. That's like, it feels really cold and unfeeling, and it's not. There are other truths as well. There are lunar truths. There are solar, so it's just the nodes are both considered sort of malefic. They're, so at any rate, I hope that helps. But think about any transits to your north nodes as things that you can get attached to, and the way that the lesson of what you attach yourself to can provide you with a platform for spiritual growth, and really learning and understanding what matters. I think it was Thoreau who said the real cost of anything in life is the amount of life that it requires from you to maintain. There's most of what we think we want requires so much to maintain, and it's through. But as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, it's through being in full loving service and duty to those things that you choose out of ambition that you end up really deepening your spiritual life too. So even though my ego, my ambition chose these things, they're my teachers now. You know what I mean? So I wouldn't have it any other way. My daughter is the light of my life. So anyway, all right. So we're going to end here now. This has been a long session. I really enjoyed doing this, and I'm learning more about doing this. So we'll hopefully do another one sometime in the next week. And if you have more questions for me that you'd ever like me to take, I'll do these Q&As once in a while. Otherwise, I'm going to try to keep them topical. And hopefully, oh, by the way, I should mention, so I'm in the middle of a 40-day campaign to raise money for my work as an astrologer in the year ahead. I'm going to post the link in the chat box right now to my annual Kickstarter. If you are able to pitch in, anything and everything helps support my work in 2018. You can pick a reading, and as a thank you gift, there it is. You can pick a reading as a thank you gift, and I'd be happy to send you a recording in the new year. And there's also discounted tuition to my wife's herbal program, to our yoga teacher training program at the studio, and to my online astrology courses. So thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great Saturday. We'll see you again soon.